All right, just to write this last line here. And with that, I can finally go back to actually coding something. Oh, shoot. Hi, everyone. Did you miss me? It's been a while since I was last here. For those who don't know who I am, my name is Matthew Shiroma, a cloud engineer at Nebulaworks. My job here is implementing new software and automating the deployment of cloud infrastructure. So, the topic for today's video is, what is your team's approach in pushing updates and bug fixes? If your team's goal is to streamline code changes with little overhead, then this is the video for you. To accomplish this, teams can leverage using continuous integration and continuous development, also known as CI/CD, into their workflows. There are a multitude of tools that can accomplish this, but for the sake of this video, we will be covering Azure DevOps Pipelines. Now, to be successful with this tool, I will be highlighting 3 important points when it comes to utilizing this tool so that you and your team can be more effective at utilizing Azure DevOps Pipelines. If you like what you're hearing so far, please like, comment, and hit that bell near our channel so you'll be the first one to see our latest content. If there are any tools that you wish to learn more about, I suggest reading up on the following links that I provided in the description below. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So the first thing that I want to kind of go over when it comes to using Azure DevOps Pipelines in its best practices is variables. And the reason why I want to go into variables is because variables are a key part of using Azure DevOps Pipelines. Now, before we dive into that, I wanted to do a brief little summary of variables for those who aren't as familiar with them. But if you are familiar with variables, don't worry. There's a big picture to this put behind me. So feel free to either skip this part or just hang on because there will be a point to all this. So what I have behind me is 2 different scenarios that we can have when it comes to utilizing variables, and both of which are fairly simple. But the thing I wanted you to take away from all this is variable scope. Now, what is variable scope? Scope is where variables are defined in and where they can be utilized in. If they're, let's say, defined in the uppermost scope of, let's say, of a Java file or any scripting file that you may have, then that variable can be used everywhere. But if it's, let's say, defined in, let's say, one more level inward, like in a class or in a function, then that variable scope is only limited to what in that current region it's currently declared in. While it can still use variables from the global scope, the global scope can't reference variables within the variables that are within a scope inward. So let me explain just a little bit more so that way it makes a little more sense. So what I have here is 3 different variables and a function here. So now, in this section here, there are 3 different variables, as I mentioned before, but because they're defined in the global scope, because we're presuming this is all within one file, these variables can be referenced in here without any repercussion or any wrongdoing. Same thing in here, because these variables are referenced within the same scope, they can be utilized within here, but here's the interesting thing is, because they're within one level inward, not only they can utilize the variables within itself, but also variables outside of it. As you can see here, since we're referencing this variable moo, and we have a variable in here called moo as well, because moo is a globally referenced variable, or it's at the most scope, this function can call on it, thereby making both of these things perfectly valid statements. So now let's kind of jump to section 2. This one is kind of the same idea, but there is one big mistake in this one. Do you see it? If not, it's because we're referencing this variable in here. Now, normally in most programming languages, this is not allowed because this variable is not scoped within this area. So as a result, this will not compile properly. So why did I mention all this? Because Azure DevOps Pipelines, this is literally the exact same method and terminology when it comes to leveraging variables for your pipelines. Like, you have a globally defined variable section within your pipelines that any task group, any task can utilize, as well as whatever scripts that those tasks may have defined in them. But the thing is, though, is that when you define a variable within a task, those variables cannot be used outside of that task unless you're using something called custom variables, which I will go over momentarily. So Let me just quickly hop on to my computer screen and I'll kind of show you them in action. I'm back and I'm in my little nice chair here about to show you guys some nice little pipeline in action. So as I mentioned before, I wanted to show you guys how variables look like in Azure DevOps. So as you can see in my little board here, let me just full screen really quick so you don't see all my little widgets. And now you can kind of get a glimpse of what exactly I've been doing for this little demonstration. So as you can see here, I made a build pipeline where if you just hit this button here, it takes us to the editing screen for this build pipeline. Now, there's a lot of information here, and I know it might be a little overwhelming for those that are new, but don't worry. The focus of this part is only going to be this area here called the variables section. As you name it, you find all the variables here. Now, as you can see here, all your variables that you want to define, they are all stored in here. And as I mentioned in the earlier part, this is all globally scoped, meaning that anything you declared in here, you are free to use in any of the task jobs in here, and it will be able to interpolate properly in here without any sort of error. So in other words, if you need to have a variable that's scoped within your entire pipeline that you may use more than once, you make sure you put your variable into here. Now, you may be seeing this asterisk thing here, and you may be wondering what's that mean. Basically, that is a secret variable. And the really nice thing about Azure DevOps Pipeline is that when you declare a variable a secret, not only you can't see it in the GUI anymore, but when you look into the logs of the pipeline, it will also be hidden there as well. So there's virtually no way of you to be able to leak out sort of the value that you have for like the access key, or in my case, these variables here that I marked as confidential. So in order to do that, all you need to do is simply hit this little button here, and it'll change your variable to be, well, in this case, it'll change it to plain text. But if you have, let's say, this variable here, that's not a secret, you want to make it a secret, simply just hit this, and it'll become a secret automatically. Now, in order to make a new variable, all you really just need to do is just hit this add button here, and just type in whatever you want. So let's just say foo, and we can give it any value you want. So I'll just say testing, and boom, we are done. We made a new variable now. So in order to reference this variable, all we need to do is just go into any of our tasks right now. Let's just kind of go into here, for instance. I will explain this syntax later, so don't worry about it. But in order to use this variable, all we would have to do is just do this, which if you know your bash, this may look a little similar because it's basically the same syntax in bash. So in other words, if you know how to reference bash variables, or in this case actually bash functions that you want to get the variable out of specifically, it's the same exact way. And this is how Azure sort of differentiates its variables from, let's say, variables within the scripts that you're making, which I will get into right now. So as you may have noticed, there's this little syntax here that may look a little strange for those that are new to it. Well, this syntax here is how Azure defines dynamic variables. Now, dynamic variables are a little different than normal variables, as we kind of saw earlier. Dynamic variables are basically variables that are created during the running of the pipeline. So as you can see here, I created these 5 variables, sorry, I can't count right now, that I will be utilizing during this pipeline because I am going to be basically creating a simple Terraform deployment in Azure using these environment variables as sort of the login credentials for me to authenticate myself into Azure. So one way to sort of accomplish this in Azure DevOps Pipelines is creating a dynamic variable like this and setting your secret or whatever into that variable like so. Now, there's one catch to this though, is that when you do this, you actually can't use this variable until the next task that's up ahead. So I can't, let's say, call on ARM client secret until I get to this step here, in which case it will be available for this step to utilize. So just a heads up. And in other words, when you're setting up your task out like this, make sure your variables that you want to set up dynamically are set up before the task that is using said variables. So yeah, that does about it for the variable section, and I will see you guys in a little bit where I'm going to be going back up over there to tell you a little bit more about triggers. So after we covered variables, I kind of want to go into this next section now called triggers, which is another key component of Azure DevOps Pipelines. So what exactly is a trigger? Well, that's a great question, because triggers are basically what makes up a CI/CD workflow, and it is essentially the glue that sort of binds the code to the testing environment of whatever you are testing with in your environment. Let me redo that. Let me redo the intro. 1, 2, 3, go. So after we covered variables, I kind of want to go into this next section called triggers, building off of the skills that we kind of learned from in the previous section. Now, triggers are very important in CI/CD workflows because they are the glue that binds the code and your testing together. So that way, when your developers push code up to, let's say, a repository, they will know for a fact that after the code is successfully being done pushed, it will be in a state where they are confident to know that it can work in different environments as long as they configured their pipelines and their tests to work properly. So let's kind of start from the beginning, just in case if some people aren't familiar with CI in particular. So what I have here is I drew out a little diagram here that kind of showcases the example workflow that I have for Azure DevOps. Now, to kind of start us off, let's just say we have a developer that likes to write code. Obviously, I hope so. And this developer is writing code for a very long time. And then he decides to push it up to GitHub via the Git CLI or something. But then he realizes, oh no, I didn't test my code before then. What would happen if it breaks the entire repository? Well, the thing is though, is that with CI, that problem can almost be negligible just because of what we're about to describe right now. So when you push your code up to GitHub, what happens here is that GitHub sort of understands that an action has taken place, whether it's a push, whether it's a pull request, or whatever. And that action that sort of reverberates outside, the entities called webhooks can then listen for a specific call and then respond accordingly to whatever it is that they're configured to do. So let's say in our Azure DevOps environment that we set up here, we made a build pipeline, and we're like, okay, what do we do in order to connect the build pipeline so that way we can connect to our code? Well, as I mentioned before, we would do something called a webhook, or in this case, a trigger. In other words, does that ring a bell when I say trigger? This trigger here is is the key thing that sort of connects Azure to GitHub in this workflow. So if we configured a trigger to basically listen on GitHub Git pushes, we can then tell Azure to be like, okay, I heard there's some new code in the GitHub repository, so I want to start this build pipeline so that way I can start testing this code if there's any errors, or if I just want to make sure everything looks good to go before I push it out to, let's say, production or whatnot. So once this trigger gets activated, this build will automatically get kicked off, as I mentioned before. So as a result, as we have right now, when the developer pushes code up to GitHub, the build pipeline will then automatically get triggered as long as the trigger gets configured beforehand. So that way this build pipeline will be like, okay, there's some new data out there in GitHub. Let me just grab it and do whatever I need to do on it. And that whatever is usually like some test or some extra checks to make sure that your code is up and running according to what your standards are. So let's say we finish up with the build pipeline. Now we're like, okay, how can I then tell the next step to be like, this code is good, I want to push it to some other environments now to see if it works in there. Now this is where the CD comes into place, where let's say we made a release pipeline, but then we were like, okay, we would need to connect it somehow to our results from the build pipeline, and to accomplish that, we will do the exact same thing as above, make a trigger again, because now this trigger can be configured to listen for any new output that comes from this build pipeline. And when we do get something from that, the release pipeline will kick off, and it will then do whatever it needs to do, like let's say pushing your code to another staging environment, maybe to another region per se, and so forth. And at that point, you know that when your release pipeline is finished, your code will be in pretty much in a good state where anyone can access it. So let me conclude this section with just one more thought. Why are triggers important? Why am I covering this? That's a great question, because triggers, as I said before, they are the glue that holds together your workflow when it comes to integrating your code with Azure DevOps Pipelines. Because without triggers, how would this guy be able to know that his code was able to go through successfully? He would have to manually do these tests out, as well as manually push out those updates into those other stages, and that would just take a really long time. With triggers, it sort of simplifies that process, and that now all he has to worry about after the initial configuration, of course, is push up the code to GitHub and sort of let everything else do the rest. So let's kind of just dive right into what I meant when I talked about how triggers are the glue that binds your code and Azure DevOps Pipelines together. So first off, make sure you have a pipeline that's already integrated with your repository, and the quickest way to do that is just to kind of go into this button I just showed you and just select where your repo is located. And once you do that, you basically have the first step down, and what's that? In order to connect your pipeline that you made, I already made two pipelines ready for you guys. One of which is a simple build pipeline that just verifies if your Terraform code is correct, and the second one where it actually builds it Terraform. It's a very simple deployment. It's nothing too complicated. For the purpose of this demonstration, I just wanted to show you guys just exactly how this works. So, in order to start the trigger for this pipeline, all you have to do is just go into this trigger tab, and where you see in here the continuous integration, make sure you hit enable continuous integration. Polling interval, that just basically means how many seconds does it take for the Azure DevOps to sort of check to see if there's a new change in your repository, and if so, it'll then kick off a build. And the branch filters, all this does, it just checks for which branches to kind of look out for. So usually you want your master branch to be here, because that's usually where all your code's gonna be located, or at least your main code that you want to be pushed up to build pipeline. So with all that said, I kind of wanted to show you guys just a little demonstration of it. It might take a while just because just the nature of the CI/CD kind of getting kicked into place. But if not, I do have a pre-made build already done for you. But basically, the workflow that should happen is once you are done with your code, by the way, don't push the master. I'm only doing it just for the sake of this video. Just commit your code to your repository. Oh, oops, I did not git commit, git add. Everyone derps like that all the time. So once you do that, make sure you just do your commit where it did changes, or whatever message you want to give. And once you do that, Azure DevOps Pipeline will see that there's a new change in your master branch, because I specified it to be the master branch, and it will then queue off a build in the process. Now, if it's done successfully, it will look something like this, where if you go into your little build history, it shows you a really nice view of all the steps that you did, as well as if it failed anywhere, and showing you any, let's say, any sort of configuration or any sort of test that it did. So in this case, I just initialized Terraform, and as you can see here, it initialized beautifully. So for all that said, the main reason why you want to do this sort of thing, connect your pipelines together with your code, is that this greatly simplifies your process. As you can see right here, it's building as we speak. So as I said before, it might take a while, but anyway, so the reason why we have this being built out like this is because it allows for you to only focus on your code and leave the testing to essentially an automated tool, because in the end, you don't want people to basically keep on doing this test every single time as they push up their code. Like, even though this is like pretty self-explanatory, this test, in production, when you have, let's say, 10 or 20 tests, you don't want to keep doing this all the time. You want to have like some sort of way to easily do those tests while you're pushing up your code and that's exactly what CI/CD tools allow you to do. And triggers is the thing that is the sort of glue, as I mentioned before, that sticks both your code and your repo, your code and your pipeline together into one. So Yes. So after moving on from triggers, the last thing I want to cover today in this video is task groups. Now, what is a task group? What the heck is that? To kind of simplify my explanation on what a task group is, I have instead written up these two scenarios here in pseudocode. Don't compile them, please. And to kind of goad you into what exactly a task group is. So let's kind of get started here, shall we? So in scenario one, we have a main method, main function, whatever you call it. And in here we have 4 lines of code. And if you pay close attention to these 4 lines of code, you would notice that there are 2 specific spots in here that sort of fluctuate. Now, what is that supposed to mean? Well, all that really is that in this sort of scenario, I just wanted to do these 4 lines of code the exact same way, except just change 2 parameters here just because I just wanted them to do something a little different from each other. But as you can see here, this and this, that's already a lot of lines of code, and who knows what also might be in the middle. So this would just look really messy and just kind of hard to follow when it comes to just understanding this block of code. Now, moving on to scenario 2 now, instead of having a really big main method, all you really have instead is this little function block here. Now, this function block, notice that it has the exact same 4 lines of code, except it has one key difference. Can you see what that difference is? If you did, congratulations, you now just understand coding 101. Now I'm just messing. Anyway, as you can see here, we added in some arguments into here. So if you understand just some general coding, what this basically means is that if, let's say we call in this function, we can pass in whatever parameter we want and it'll basically fill in for these words in here. So looking at our main method here, you can see that we called on this function twice, but we passed in 2 different parameters in here. So, as you can see here, this is a lot cleaner than this because we're just declaring it only once. And in here, we're not doing it again. So we not only saved ourselves some time, but we also made our main function look a lot cleaner, making us very happy developers. So, what's the point of all this? Well, what if I just told you that this is exactly what task groups are? Task groups in Azure DevOps Pipelines, what it is that they are just basically a group of tasks that are organized together in a way that allows for pipeline makers to associate tasks that can do a certain function together, so that way when it comes to reusing them, or let's say just using them again, all you would have to do to call on them is just call on the task group within your pipeline, as opposed to redefining those 4 or 5 or however steps you may have and just changing the parameters of them just a little bit just because you might want to have it be a different test per se. So that's basically task groups in a nutshell. Now I want to show you how they sort of look like in action now as I go over to the GUI in just a bit. See you there. Hey everyone again. I'm going to quickly just dive right into it right now and talk about task groups that I sort of mentioned previously. So before we kind of dive in, I just want to show you my release pipeline that I made to kind of demonstrate this purpose. And this release pipeline is very, very simple. All it's doing is it's deploying my Terraform code that I laid out in my GitLab repository and just building out to Azure. So as you can see in this stage here, all the stage is doing is that it's just destroying my Terraform code that I already written out beforehand. And as you can see here, it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's too beefy because it's pretty small, but do note though that like there are some tasks in here that you can sort of group together and sort of be like, okay, if someone were to use this in the future, they can just call on this one group and be able to like do the exact same as I'm doing right here, which is exactly what a task group is. So in order to sort of make a task group, all you have to do, if you're in this view that is, just hit these little circles here to sort of select multiple tasks, right click, and just hit create task group. Once you do that, you'll be taken into this view right here where not only it shows you all the tasks that you just defined right now in their own little area, but you can also specify the definition of this task group by setting its name, the description of it, as well as, most importantly, the parameters that you can add in here. So the really cool thing about this is not only you can set a default value, so if you know a value is going to be pretty common throughout people building out your pipeline, you can set the values here, but also you can even do a little description of saying what exactly this parameter is. So when people were to say use your use your task group in the future, they will be able to understand, oh, this is exactly what this parameter is being used for, as opposed to kind of just guessing based on the name by itself. I thought that was a really cool touch to it. So, and once you do this, you're pretty much good to go. Now, whenever you run into an area where you can use your task group, such as right here, all you have to do is just hit this add a task, search for it. So in this case, it's called configure Terraform run, and voila, just add it into here, and boom, it's right here as it is. And the best thing about it is that if you're ever curious to see what is going on underneath the covers, all you have to do is just hit manage task group, and you'll be taken right into this view again. So what's the key takeaway from this? So even though my use case right now is very mundane in terms of what exactly it's doing, this will still save a lot of time in the long run, because I'm essentially saying, okay, I want to install a specific version of Terraform, and I want to initialize the Terraform as well. So if someone were to be doing the exact same thing as I am, they don't have to sort of recreate those 2 steps I did in the task group. They can just call that one task group that I just made, and it'll automatically do that for them in their job. So they can focus on their end on some other things that may not be as replicable or as reusable in other use cases. So that is the biggest advantage of using task groups in Azure DevOps Pipeline. To wrap up this video, there are 3 takeaways that you should pull from this video. Firstly, understand the difference between pipeline and release variables. Secondly, consider using triggers when it comes to integrating your build and release pipelines. Thirdly, utilizing task groups will save you a lot of time in the long run when it comes to making new pipelines. If you follow all 3 of those points, then you and your team will be more successful at using Azure DevOps Pipelines in your workflow. Thank you again for tuning into this video. If you liked what you saw, please like, comment, and hit that bell near our channel so you'll be the first one to see our latest curated DevOps content. If you have any questions of what we covered today, please send us an inquiry at the following link below. All right, well, that does it for me. Thank you again, and take care.